Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Sit back and relax, because it's time for another episode of Rock and Read. Today we'll read Chapter 6 of White Line Fever by Lemmy. I originally planned on reading a different book today, however, one of my viewers politely requested that I read more of the Lemmy book. Ask and you shall receive. Chapter 6 is even longer than Frank Zappa's discography. If I read the whole chapter, this video would be close to an hour long. I don't want that. So I decided to split Chapter 6 into two different parts. We'll read Part 1 this time and Part 2 next time. Part 1 is called Motorhead. Here we go. I had my revenge on Hawkwind for firing me. By the time they got back to England, I had stolen my equipment out of the band's storage space. I don't remember how we got in now, actually. We must have got somebody from the office to nick the key for me or something. In fact, I don't even remember who came along with me. It was Lucas Fox, probably, who wound up drumming in Motorhead for the first few months. He was the only one I knew who had a car. We had just got my stuff in the van when Alan Powell caught us. That was a nice coincidence since I had just seen his wife. He was shouting, "Yeah, you thought you'd steal your stuff back." We drove off laughing, and I yelled back, "Yeah, go and ask your wife." But I don't think he did, because I saw her again the week after, and she never mentioned it. I was also busy doing other, more important things. Within 2 weeks of getting back to London, I put together the band that was to become Motorhead. I wanted it to be sort of like the MC5, since that was the big hero band of most of the underground, and throw in elements of Little Richard and Hawkwind, and that's more or less how it turned out. We were a blues band, really. Although we played it at 1,000 miles an hour, it was recognizable as blues. At least to us it was. Probably it wasn't to anybody else. It was pretty easy getting the band together, really. Too easy, in fact. Within a very short period of time, I had recruited guitarist Larry Wallace and Lucas Fox as the drummer. Larry I already knew. He'd been in UFO before they made a record, and he had been playing guitar for the Pink Fairies after the departure of Paul Rudolph, the guy who replaced me in Hawkwind. Pretty incestuous, hey? On top of that, the Pink Fairies and Hawkwind used to play on stage together, billed as Pinkwind. Hawk Fairies didn't work, really. Lucas was introduced to me by my roommate at the time, a girl named Irene Theodoro, who I called Motorcycle Irene after the Moby Grape song. I had begun living with her before I went on my last tour with Hawkwind. She wasn't a girlfriend of mine, just a friend, although we did have some wild times together. She was a very nice girl, and a good photographer. She did some shots of us in the early days. Lucas had been hanging around with Irene, hoping to her. He never did, of course. He was a bit of a dork, but a very sound guy, really. And since he was always around and a drummer and had a car, he appeared very handy. I didn't want to sing. I wanted somebody else to do it. But the problem with that, of course, is you get stuck with a singer. No matter. We never did find anybody else, and I wound up doing the vocals. At first I was going to call the band Bastard, a name which pretty much summed up the way I felt. But the guy who was managing us at the time, Doug Smith, he had been managing Hawkwind, that's how I knew him, didn't think it was a good idea. It's very unlikely that we're going to get on top of the pops with a name like that, he pointed out. I figured he was probably right, so I decided to call the band Motorhead. It made sense. Motorhead was the last song I wrote for Hawkwind, and it was also the American slang for speed freak, so all the pieces fit. And it was a one-word name. I believe in one-word names for bands. They're easy to remember. So I took my psychedelic-colored amps, painted them flat black, and Motorhead got underway. The press was having a field day with us. My firing from Hawkwind had been in all the British music papers, and everybody wanted to know what I was up to. That was when I came up with the famous quote that first appeared in Sounds. "It'll be the dirtiest rock and roll band in the world. If we moved in next door, your lawn would die." Actually, I stole that line from Dr. Hook, but it quickly became the first of Motorhead's many catchphrases. Our first show was on July 20th, 1975 at the Roadhouse. That was fast, considering I'd left Hawkwind in May. We opened for Greenslade, a kind of pop rock band formed by this guy Dave Greenslade, who had been somebody's keyboardist. All the bands in those days had intro tapes, and since I've always been a World War II fanatic, we used a recording from Germany of marching feet and people yelling. It just sounded really powerful and incredibly cold, all those feet smashing on the German cobblestones, that brump, brump, trumping sound. That was our outro tape, too. I had a silver-painted human skull on stage, on the top of my stack. But in spite of those theatrical touches, I have to admit, we weren't very good. Bloody awful, let's face it. Undaunted, we proceeded to get on a trek of England through most of August. After all, that's the only way you get better. You keep playing. We were already attracting fans, though. Punks, old Hawkwind fans, and a horde of nasty characters were coming to see us. And some of them were really getting into it. One young kid showed up at our first show in white boots and a bullet belt, just like mine. And I'd only gotten the boots 2 weeks before, so he was really early. From the start, we were inspiring slavish loyalty in people. That's the funny thing about Motorhead. Our fans and our crews really latch onto us. The sound man we have now has been with us since around 1977. He made a bunch of money when he was working for Black Sabbath. The tour we asked him to do was only going to make him a third of the money, but there he was on the plane with Sabbath's crew, plotting all our sounds and lights. Somebody told him, "You should be doing Black Sabbath stuff." And he replied, "Yeah, man, but these are my boys." And he left that tour to come and do us. We've always had people like that. It's some sort of disease people catch from the ultimate underdog band. And we were definitely underdogs at our next London gig, which was at the Hammersmith Odeon on October 19th, 1975. We were supporting Blue Oyster Cult, but we certainly didn't get any help from them. In fact, they sabotaged us completely. They gave us no sound check, and the Odeon is notorious for its bad sound. I've noticed that a lot of American bands treat their openers poorly, like they want to destroy the competition before it even has a chance to compete. British bands don't do that. At least, they mostly don't, nor does Motorhead. That show earned us a new reputation and our own category in the Sounds poll for that year. We were voted Best Worst Band in the World. Nevertheless, we had a record deal with United Artists. They were Hawkwind's label, and they decided to hang on to me, at least for the time being. That was good, or so we thought at the time. So late in the year, we went down to Rockfield Studios, which is located on a farm in Monmouth, South Wales, to make a record. Dave Edmunds was going to produce it. Dave is one of my heroes. He became famous with Rockpile and as a solo artist, but I knew him from Love Sculpture, which was his first band. They did an instrumental version of Sabre Dance, which was the fastest thing you've ever heard in your life. It's some of the best guitar, too, because everybody was on pills then, and Dave was fast already. Unfortunately, Edmunds only recorded 4 tracks with us: Lost Johnny, Motorhead, 2 of the songs I wrote while in Hawkwind, Leaving Here, an excellent Eddie Holland song. I used to see the Byrds play in my Manchester days, and City Kids, a Pink Fairies number that Larry wrote. Then Dave got signed to Led Zeppelin's label, Swan Song, and they took him away. That was too bad, because I really liked working with him. He was just like one of us. I recall one night when we were listening back to a track, Dave stood up and said, "Excuse me." He went out the door and threw up. Then he simply came back, sat down, and carried on. We used to find him slumped over the board with white noise howling out of the speakers. He also helped me fix a guitar. One of my strings kept jumping out of the nut, that thing that your strings go on at the top of the neck. So he told me, "All you need on there is a bracket above it. Come with me." And we broke through a window of this tool shed on the farm to get a drill. Then he smashed this old guitar, took the bracket off of it, drilled holes on my guitar, and put it on. It's still there to this day. Good man. Edmunds, great spur-of-the-moment guy, and he's made some great records. He produced the Everly Brothers comeback album with Jeff Lynne and the Stray Cats, among many others. After Dave, we wound up with Fritz Fryer as producer. He was in a 60s band called the Four Pennies, which had a couple of number ones in England. A very good band, but they were a bit soppy. So Fritz finished up our record, which was a shame, really. He was alright, but he wasn't the man Edmunds was, which is not surprising since he was the man Fryer was. It was around the time Edmonds left that we changed drummers. We decided that Lucas had to go because he was starting to get very weird. He was trying to keep up with my speed habit, and of course, you can't. In fact, I don't especially recommend my lifestyle. It will slaughter the average person. This is no joke, and I'll tell you how I know. Around 1980, I decided to have my blood changed. You know, the same process Keith Richards is rumored to have gone through. It's a good idea, logically, because instantly you get untainted, fresh blood, and your body doesn't have to go through the stress of detoxing. So my manager and I went to the doctor, who took some blood tests and came back with the bad news. "I gotta tell you this," he said, "pure blood will kill you." What? You don't have human blood anymore, and you can't give blood either. Forget it. You'd kill the average person because you're so toxic. In other words, what's normal for me is deadly to another human, and what's normal for other humans is deadly to me, which is okay with me. I suppose that means I've made medical history of some sort. I'm going to leave my body to medical science fiction, me and Stephen Wright. So keeping up with my habit was getting Lucas very tense. The veins on his head would stand out, and he'd stare at you very intently for long periods without speaking. He'd be doing this, and the rest of us would look at each other thinking, well, he's obviously gone over the top. We were in the studio once listening to a playback, and Lucas was leaning against the console. The top part was hinged in a certain way so it could be cleaned, and somebody hadn't put the catches back right. And there was all this stuff on it, half-finished drinks and ashtrays, and so when Lucas leaned on it, the whole console flipped open and everything fell in. Sparks flew. The whole thing blew up. So he screamed and stepped back and knocked the phone off the wall. Then he shot out the door. And Larry opened the door and called after him, "Hey, Lucas, don't walk past my stacks. They'll burst into flames." So it was clear that Lucas was on his way out. I ran into him, funnily enough, a couple of years ago in Paris. He was dressed like a Frenchman with a handkerchief hanging out of his pocket. Looking at him, I thought maybe he'd turned gay, but he said he was living with a girl over there. Lucas was a good enough geezer, really, and a good friend to me, but he just didn't have the bite. Meanwhile, Phil Taylor had been hanging around. I met him about 6 months prior at this guy's flat. Paul, a guitar player. Paul's a great anti-heroin advertisement. He fell asleep, passed out on smack with his arm leaning against an iron bedstand, and his hand died. He cut all the tendons in his arm. I saved Paul's life. He was dead. He was blue, and I beat him on the chest until his heart started again. He wasn't the first one I saved, and he certainly wasn't the last. But back to Phil. He had a car, so he was able to give me a lift down to the studio, which was about 200 miles from London. After he had mentioned to me that he was in the habit of banging on drums now and again, we thought we'd give him a go. We played a couple numbers down at the studio, and Larry in particular was taken with him. "What a horrible little," he chortled. "He's perfect." Phil wound up overdubbing the drums on nearly the whole album. The only song he didn't do was Lost Johnny, because that track sounded okay as it was. Overdubbing drums is quite a feat, because the drums are what you usually base a song on. It's kind of like going ass backwards. But Phil did it great, and for a very long time, he was an asset to Motorhead. One thing he couldn't do, though, was sing. On this album, which eventually was called On Parole, Larry sang on 3 of the songs, On Parole and Fools, both of which he wrote, and Vibrator, which he wrote with his roadie, Des Brown. Des also wrote the words for Iron Horse / Born to Lose. Larry thought it would be good to have Phil sing on one track, so we tried him out on City Kids. It didn't work. He sounded like 2 cats being stapled together. It was so funny that I was outside in my farmyard in the rain on my knees. I was laughing so hard. So we had to scotch that idea. We finished up the album, which also included The Watcher, another song I wrote while in Hawkwind. Then the holes at United Artists began hedging about the record's release. For months they'd fed us numerous lies while still keeping us signed to the label. That, of course, kept us from being able to record with any other company. They wound up putting out On Parole 4 years later, long after we had finally been released from our contract. They claimed that the UA staff had turned over, and the new people had a new attitude toward the record. Strangely enough, their change of heart came just about the time we were starting to become really successful. Coincidence? I think not. That was the beginning of our up dealings with record companies. Day one, Jack, and that was it. It was around the time that UA was buggering us about that, we also began our sordid history of various management changes. Doug Smith farmed us out to this guy from Belgium whose name I cannot remember to save my life. He was funny. He tried to talk British slang in a futile attempt to appear hip. In England, one might say, a bunch of to describe a group of guys. You never say about a woman in England. I discovered the difference in America quite early on, incidentally. So the Belgian would come into a room and say, where are my bunches of... Belgian translations of English are miraculous, but he was hopeless and faded out because he ran out of money. Then for a while we had this sweaty maniac, Frank Kennington, managing us. He was a friend of our guitarist who by then was Eddie Clark. I'll be getting to Eddie very shortly. Frank's father had a factory. I don't know what they were making. Small things, I believe. Small, indispensable lenses, that's it. Lenses and prisms and things like that for industry. And Frank had taken the factory over from his father, so he had quite a bit of money. We rectified that situation, however, by bankrupting him completely. We owed the poor some money till the day he died, in fact. Although, incidentally, I finally paid him my share in 1996, 20 years late. Still, better late than never. He eventually moved to America, where he was known, not surprisingly, as English Frank. After we ruined Frank's financial affairs, we were managed for quite a while by this guy called Tony Secunda. I believe I met him through Chrissy Hind, who I'd known for a number of years. Chrissy used to be a journalist for the New Musical Express, and I was always very impressed by the fact that, though she had no tits to speak of, she could play very good guitar. She was very good indeed. She was squatting in Chelsea when I knew her, and I used to go round there and jam with her all night. Before she had the Pretenders, she was in a band called the Moors Murderers. That was an extremely bad taste. They all wore black, pointed hoods when they played. Very bad taste indeed. Luckily, they never had a hit, or we probably would have never seen Chrissy's face. She would have been in a black hood for the rest of her professional career. Anyhow, back to Tony Secunda. Tony used to manage the Move and Steel Eye Span, and he had a label, Wizard Records, in England. He was a very interesting man from an anthropological point of view. A complete lunatic. He went to Peru and came back with this Indian who went everywhere with him, and he was doing cocaine like nothing on earth. Teaspoons of the... And he was paranoid about people eavesdropping. He used to mutter, earwigs listening to what I say, earwigs all over. And this Indian would be standing behind him, arms folded across his chest. Really very weird. But Secunda came up with some wild publicity schemes. He did this publicity stunt once where the Move took an atomic bomb to the middle of Piccadilly in Manchester for a photo shoot. And once, on being told that he had a very large tax bill coming up, he dropped them through the ceiling at the end of one of Steel Eye's gigs at the Hammersmith Odeon. He figured that since the government would have taken the money away anyhow, he might as well make it a deductible gift. Another Secunda stunt with the Move involved a dirty postcard with British Prime Minister Harold Wilson, but that backfired on him. He had to apologize to the Prime Minister and pay all kinds of money and libel, you know. While he was working with Motorhead, he had our logo painted on the side of this building on the main roundabout coming into London from the west. It only took us an hour to get it up. We put 10 art students up on scaffolding and had them paint a square each, but it took the residents 3 months to get it taken off. So for those 3 months, we had top drawer publicity. Free! Originally, I had intended that Motorhead be a 4-piece band, and we tried out a couple different guitarists. One was Ariel Bender, known at the time as Luther Grosvenor, who was in Moth the Hopeful and Spooky Tooth. We did a few rehearsals with him, but it didn't work out. He was a nice guy, but he just wasn't our type. He didn't have the same sense of humor as the rest of us, and I couldn't imagine being on a bus with him. So we carried on as a 3-piece until we found Eddie Clark, and wound up carrying on as a 3-piece anyhow. Phil met Eddie when they were both renovating a houseboat down in Chelsea, but it wasn't Phil who brought him to us. It was Aeroplane Gertie, who was a receptionist for this rehearsal studio in Chelsea. We were rehearsing there for free. If somebody quit early and there were a couple hours left, we'd whip our gear in and use the leftover time. Gertie used to wear a hat with a plastic airplane stuck on it, hence the name Aeroplane Gertie. She was living with Eddie, and it was she who brought him round to the rehearsal studio. We decided to try him out, and it turned out to be a very weird situation. Larry didn't show up right away, so me, Eddie, and Phil began jamming. It was going along pretty well by the time Larry showed up, hours later. Then Larry started playing along, but he was so loud that we couldn't hear anything else for half an hour. After that, he left, and that was it. He quit the band, and Larry was the one who was always on to us about getting another guitar player, so go figure. But Motorhead always worked really great as a trio anyway, and still does today. If there's two guitars, then you have to sorta toe the line a bit, because if the two guitars ain't together, and the bass too, of course, it's really messy. But with only one guitar player, you can do anything. I used to play all kinds of weird behind Eddie, and it would work. Right off the bat, I was trying to find nicknames for everyone. Nicknames are good, people like them. So Eddie became Fast Eddie Clark, which was logical, really. I mean, he was a fast guitar player. Phil became Phil Dangerous Taylor for a few months. Although the nickname was apt, he certainly was dangerous to himself. It didn't last. It was Motorcycle Irene who christened him Filthy Animal Taylor. By then, Phil and Irene were living together, so she knew whereof she spoke. Eddie and Phil were great friends. At one point, Phil was living at Eddie's house. They were as close as brothers, which was occasionally problematic because they fought like brothers too. Like one would turn around and the other would say something, and the next thing you know, bang! They were beating the out of each other. The two of them used to fist fight all the time. On the way to one gig we had in Brighton, Phil and Eddie were punching each other in the van the whole way down. By the time we got there, Phil had a black eye and Eddie's arm was bad. But when it came time to go on, I said, "Okay, that's it, on stage." And they both straightened up and went, "Okay." And we did the show. Then when we were coming off the stage, Phil smacked Eddie in the back of the neck and sent him sprawling. And there they went all over again. As fighters, they were pretty well matched. Eddie was always thought of amongst our fans as the quiet one, but he was more vicious than Phil. He really is a nasty piece of work when the fists start flying. I remember him and Phil both rescuing me out of a fight. This guy jumped me from behind in this boozer in Portobello Road, and Eddie and Phil got a hold of him and his two mates, and they just wound him out of the door and kicked him down the street. I never even got a chance to punch in. I couldn't get at them because Phil and Eddie had him busy. Incidentally, the week after that, the geezer from the pub broke a pool cue over my head. Those were the days, eh? This new lineup of Motorhead had been working together for a few months when Tony Secunda got us the deal to make a single for Stiff Records. So sometime during the summer of 1976, we did White Line Fever, a song that the three of us had written together, and leaving here for the label. Somehow UA got wind of this and started giving us trouble because we weren't yet officially out of the contract with them. At that point, we hadn't talked to UA in months. I don't know why they gave a but they kept the single from being released until 1977, which frustrated us. All through the rest of 76 and early 77, we played gigs here and there, a lot of one-offs. I remember one gig in a disco place in Shrewsbury, Tiffany's for God's sake. Eddie and I both fell flat on our backs on stage. It was one of those slippery plastic floors with lights under it, but the crew only lifted me up. Eddie used to treat them like servants, so they left him down there. There he was, lying on his back, waiting confidently to be picked up, and it never happened. On the way to another gig, Phil was angry about something and kicked the side of the van, breaking his toe. By this point, the morale of the band was getting pretty low. All our efforts were getting us nowhere. We were starving, living in squats, and nothing was happening. I was well prepared to keep going, but Phil and Eddie wanted to give it up. It wasn't their band, and they didn't have the commitment I did. So finally, in April, after much debate, we decided to do a goodbye show at the Marquee in London and call it a day. Well, that's the end of part 1. Stay tuned for part 2. Let me know what you thought of part 1 in the comments. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.